Good morning. After referring to some psychoanalytical terms or concepts, maybe it's better to mention psychoanalytic concept, referring to the concept of infantile sexuality, the Oedipus, then the Oedipus complex, then the theory of instinct or drives. And by the way, we mentioned the difference between the instinct and the drive. And then I tried to clarify the concept of pleasure principle compared to the concept of reality principle. And now we'll mention another concept, and we will share with you the PDF file from which I'm explaining and clarifying these psychoanalytic concept. Now we mention the concept of the threefold structure of the psyche from the psychoanalytic perspective, referring to the id, the ego, and the superego. First of all, when we mention the id, we are referring to pleasure and mainly to various pleasures, and this part of the psyche is mainly doesn't know the principle of contradiction. It means the id try to push the subject to satisfy the maximum of pleasures, and at the same time it push the subject to avoid the maximum of unpleasures. And this is the main component of the main component and the process by which the id is functioning and is working. And the reason why the id is referred to the deep part of the psyche, or more precisely the deep unconscious part of the psyche from the psychoanalysis. On the other hand, when we mention the ego refers to the conscious part of the psyche, and by the ego we can think and we can assess various our various reactions and behaviors, and at the same time we are able to think and to evaluate actions and reactions and behaviors of others. And this is from psychoanalysis, this is not a heavy and a powerful part of the psyche. On the contrary, it is at some point a weak the weak parts of the psyche compared to the id, and compared also to the superego. When we refer to when we refer to the id and to the superego, both of these parts of the psyche are unconscious. At the same time, the id and the superego are very powerful. The most powerful part of the psyche, or the most powerful unconscious part of the psyche, referring to the superego and to the id. Yes, the superego and the id. On the contrary, when we refer to the ego, this is the conscious parts of the psyche, and this is the weakest part of the psyche. And taking into account the importance of the unconscious from psychoanalysis, the id and the superego are most of the time are present during the life of the subject, and the ego is the part which is less present during the life of the subject. In other words, we can say that the subject is influenced mainly by the id and the superego, and most of the time the subject is less influenced, noticeably less influenced by the ego. And from this threefold structure of the psyche, you can understand thus that there are two parts of the psyche which are unconscious and which are very unconscious, and which are very powerful by their actions toward the psyche. And we have, on the other hand, the conscious part of the psyche, which is represented by the ego, and this part is much more present in the psyche, and it is influencing the psyche just a little bit compared to the influence of both the id and the superego. Now we try to define the id. Now I will define the superego. Sorry, the superego represents also the unconscious part of the psyche, and it is the part which represents moral values and religious values and social values, and it represents globally speaking, it is representing, the superego is representing the law, not in its narrow definition, but in its broad meaning, the law which reflects the law reflects that the subject has to submit itself to external rules, like you have to do this, you don't have to do this, and so on and so forth. And this is the main component, the main unconscious component of the psyche, which is represented by the superego. Compared to the id and the superego, we mentioned the ego, and the ego is representing the conscious part of the psyche, and during the free association, we are during the free association, the patient tries to to make the ego mastering both the id and the superego, because the influence of the id and the influence of both the id and the superego are showing unconscious forces and an unconscious influence, and the influence of the id and the superego are pushing the subject to do this or that without knowing why and how. Why and how to do this, why and how to behave in that way rather than to behave in this way, etc. But and this is the source of the emergence of psychological difficulties during the life, during various situations in the life of the subject. And the therapy from psychoanalysis or from the psychoanalytical perspective consists to make the ego more powerful than the power of the id and the superego. How the ego becomes more powerful compared to the power of the id and the superego? The ego becomes powerful when the psychoanalyst try to encourage the patient to deal with the free association and to question again these unconscious forces represented by the id and the superego. And when the subject and when the patient start to question it, the process of its history, by saying how I behave in that way, why I behaved in this way, etc. The patient tries to understand its own history, and this is the goal. And this is the goal of the therapy from the psychoanalytic perspective. And when the patient starts to question its history, that is to say, to transform the unconscious forces represented by the id and the superego to become a conscious part, and to become these two instances become conscious, and this is the goal of the therapy. And from and consequently the ego starts to emerge and to appear, and this is this process makes or allows the transformation of the patient who becomes a subject, and these transformations allows the subject to make a changement into the id and the superego, and the patient becomes a subject, and the unconscious part of the patient becomes a conscious part of the subject. And this is this consequence makes the apparition of the ego. And from this perspective, you can say that the ego is the instance which is conscious, and the ego is emerges during the process of the therapy and by applying the tool, the psychoanalytical tool, which is free associations. We have also to mention the central importance of anxiety and defense mechanism in neurotic reactions. And here we mentioned that the psychological difficulties appear appear during the life of the patient when this one is experiencing anxiety, and when this one is using also defense mechanism by during the neurotic reactions. And here for example, we can refer to some defense mechanism. Here, for example, I can mention some defense mechanism. We have here some defense mechanism, like, for example, displacement as a defense mechanism when somebody here in this picture on the left, somebody in the workplace, the head of the institution is blaming this person, and rather than discussing and debating the problem, the person is not expressing any reaction toward her boss, toward his boss, and rather than to express his opinion or standpoint about what happened during his various tasks in the workplace, the same person is blaming his children, and this here this person is using a defense mechanism, and he is living inside his psyche anxiety, and this anxiety is displaced from expressing his psychological displeasure, to express his displeasure toward his children. And here also we can also refer to the reparation. This is another defense mechanism, and this person, which is the child of and this person represent the child of this person, who is his father. And here the child, rather than discussing the problem with his father, she is remembering the scenario what she lived with her father, and she is leaving reparation because she repressed her negative emotional negative unconscious reaction, and she repressed her reaction and her emotion. And here we have another mechanism, defense mechanism, referring to sublimation. The sublimation is the way by which we express our unconscious desire, and we make this desire, we idealize these desires, and this the name of this defense mechanism is sublimation. And there is also another defense mechanism which is named the regression, and here the same person in the left image, he is leaving the problem with his boss, and rather than debating with his boss the problem that happened during doing his various tasks in the workplace, he is expressing, or he is using another defense mechanism, which is regression, because regression refers to expressing an emotional reaction which is mainly expressed during a childhood period. And here we notice in the image which is in the right that the person is crying. This is some defense mechanisms that we are mentioning, and we try to clarify some concept and some defense mechanisms. There are various mechanisms, and we mentioned just some of them and not all of them. Psychoanalysis is also a therapy seeks to bring about basic modification in an individual's personality by investigating his or her transference with the analyst or a therapist, and thereby eliciting and interpreting the inconscious conflict that have produced the individual's neurosis. And here we are mentioning one of the main concept in psychoanalysis, and referring to the transference. The transference refer to live again and to remember the emotional reaction that was at the source of the apparition of the psychological difficulties during the childhood period of the patient, and when the patient go to the analyst and he or she is starting to speak about his or her life, for understanding his or her history, the patient must live again what he lived during the historical process, which is at the source of the apparition of the psychological problems or difficulties. And that's what is named by the concept of transference. It means, in other words, the patient is remembering, or the presence of the analyst who is facing the patient pushes unconsciously the patient to remember these traits or some traits which are at the source from the patient to remember this or that scenario, which is at the source of remembering what happened as an anxiety or as a psychological shock or shocks during his childhood period. And by remembering, the patient can understand. And there is here, you can notice that there is a kind of an opposition between remembering emotional shock and understanding this psychological difficulty. And from psychoanalysis, to understand his or her own history cannot happen without transference. It means cannot happen without living again the original scenario, which is at the source of the apparition of psychological difficulties. The reason why the presence of the analyst will elicit these historical events, which are at the source of remembering, at the source for the patient to remember his or her own psychological difficulties. And by leaving the transference, and consequently by remembering what happened during his own historical life, the patient will be able to face his history, which means that the patient will be able to understand his history by questioning this history, by saying inside himself and facing the analyst how I lived this or that event, why I experienced this or that situation, etc. And this is what is at stake during the therapy of the psychoanalytical therapy. And by this process, the patient becomes a subject, and he becomes able to master his history and to change it from its unconscious characteristic to its conscious structure. And this is the goal of the therapy from psychoanalysis, from the psychoanalytical outlook. And the specific method used to achieve this goal are free association, as we mentioned, and dream analysis and analysis of resistance and defense, and working through the feelings revealed in the transference and counter-transference process. And when we refer to dream analysis, the patient will say that I made a dream, and which consists the content of the dream is this and that, and with the analyst, the patient will try to understand his dream, and the dream is always related to the history of the patient, and the goal consists to understand and to deconstruct the content of the dream and to make it conscious, because the dream from psychoanalysis appears as with symbols, and these symbols consist to it consists during the process of the psychotherapy. It consists to deconstruct the symbols of the dream, because the symbols of the dream appears without a clear meaning, and it consists to transform these vague and fuzzy meanings to a clear and a manifest meanings. And the process of free associations consists also to analyze the resistances and defense, because the patient mainly the patient try to avoid unpleasure emotions and try to follow his own pleasures, and the pleasure consists to forget, and the unpleasure consists to remember. But the therapy consists to inverse the therapy consists to inverse these processes, because the therapy, the main goal of the therapy consists to remember, which means to live again transference, as we mentioned. And by living again the process of transference, the patient will be able to remember the sources of his psychological difficulties. And that's what we mean by analyzing resistances and defenses. And the process of the therapy consists to the process of the therapy consists to implement the activity of working through the feelings, which means this is also another psychoanalytic big and very important psychoanalytical concept referring to working through. Working through means to understand, and to understand the various emotions that was experienced by the patient during his previous life, mainly during his childhood period, and to apply and to implement the working through their feelings consists to deconstruct consists for the patient to deconstruct his or her feelings, and this is repeated in the process of the transference and counter-transference process. And from this perspective, we can say that we cannot make a sharp distinction between working through and the process, these two processes referring to working through and transference, because we the therapy consists to understand, and by understanding we have to apply the working through, and we are understanding what we are understanding the feelings which that are repeated in the during the process of the transference. And the presence of the analyst is important, because without his presence the patient cannot live again what he lived during his historical life. And the reason why that the transference cannot appear without the presence of the analyst. But after the presence of the transference, the goal consists to understand these multiple activities of the transference, and this is why we are using the concept, or we are referring to the concept of working through. On the other hand, when we refer to the counter-transference process, this process refers to the emotional, the unconscious emotional life that is experienced not by the patient but by the analyst, because the analyst also is a human being and he or she has a history, and the patient is experiencing his mainly his own transference, but he is also facing the counter transference of the analyst, and the patient must understand both the transference and the counter transference processes by applying the working through, even that the counter transference is mainly understood by the analyst, but this also helps the patient to overcome his emotions, because he is facing both the transference and the counter transference process, and by applying and renewing his implementation of working through what he lived in an emotional terms, the patient will be able to overcome his own psychological difficulties, and this is the goal of the therapy from the psychoanalytic perspective. And thank you for your attention. And here we have also some definition of the definitions of psychoanalytic terms and concepts, and you can find these definitions in the PDF file that you can find in the e-learning platform of the University of Tlemcen Abu Bakr Belqaid in Algeria. Thank you.